Thank you. As Eric was saying, I want to talk about zombie planning and big picture planning, which, as I hope I'll be able to show, are not always the same thing. I'm not a great fan of zombie movies myself, but on the flight across from London to Hong Kong, I couldn't stop myself watching the spectacle of Brad Pitt in World War Z. In case you've not seen it, Brad is cast as a United Nations functionary trying to save the world from a plague of the undead. He is helped in his battle against the zombies by a team of US Navy SEALs, a female Israeli army conscript, and some World Health Organization researchers trapped in a laboratory in Wales, armed with baseball bats and axes. These particular zombies are the victims of a worldwide pandemic. It makes them determined to do anything they can to infect the living. They launch themselves headfirst through the windscreens of SUVs, charge airliners at takeoff velocity, and leap into helicopters, just so they can sink their fangs into their victims to spread the infection. Pretty soon, the only people not infected were trapped on an aircraft carrier in mid-Atlantic. As my plane climbed its way north over Russia and then all the way east, of course, I realized that there is a certain amount in common with the way that the zombie undead do their best to infect as many of the living as possible with one bite to the jugular, and what goes on in a certain kind of discourse about the future of the city. Ideas about urbanism and culture spread like viruses too. First an airline, then a duty-free zone, then a cultural district. West Kowloon, Singapore, Baku, Abu Dhabi. We see zombie planning in the spooky way that the Bicycles for Hire scheme that began in Paris, then spread to London with two different mayors, both claiming the credit, and then ended up in Manhattan, Milan, Prague, and Melbourne within what seemed like minutes. Such bicycles are pretty pointless in Melbourne. It's a city that likes to cycle, but imposes a legal requirement to wear a cycling helmet, which is not something that works well with the idea of an instant cycle hire service. Equally spooky is the way that the idea of the cable car as the instant solution to favela problems has spread around the world, from Caracas to Rio, in what seems like the last few minutes. Of course, it's an inspired idea in some places, but not everywhere. You could see the idea of building an outpost of the Guggenheim Empire or staging the Olympics in the name of urban renewal as manifestations of the same phenomenon of zombie planning. There are too few good ideas, and what we have spread like avian flu. Bicycles, Guggenheim franchises, massive cultural complexes, big events as alibis for urban transformation are all prefabricated big ideas, available off the shelf. They are all highly visible. That is what makes them so attractive. They present the appearance of activity, if not always its substance. Cities, or the people who are charged with the role of trying to run them, are hungry for ideas about where to go next, and it makes them particularly susceptible to zombie planning. Let's go back to one of the sources of the infection, like Brad Pitt in World War Z, in the hope of finding a cure. Moore's law on the cost of computing power is speeding up the way that the world works. But if things are changing ever more quickly, it's also true that some fundamentals don't really change at all. There are some pretty powerful ideas about city making which simply refuse to go away and die. Sometimes the parameters of cities seem to come down to a set of black and white alternatives that are always there. Are we looking to make cities high density or low density? Do we believe in downtowns or suburbs? Do we believe in strict planning systems or in laissez-faire? Do we try to legislate or do we leave things alone? Do we believe in the big picture plan or do we try to deal with the issues one pothole at a time. There's not much doubt about what Baron Haussmann and his patron Napoleon III believed in. They bet the farm on the idea of big picture city planning, which you see behind me. They took what they had seen in London, where John Nash, working for the Prince Regent, transformed the city in the early 19th century, and wanted to do even more of it in Paris when Napoleon got home. They built not just the boulevards, but the infrastructure of sewers to make the city work, and they came up with an ingenious way to finance it, and it remained the model for the idea of the modern city well into the 20th century. In Haussmann's Paris, the issues that Mumbai and Beijing and Shanghai face in the 21st century had already surfaced, positive as well as negative. Treating cities with the techniques of big picture planning has consequences. In the Paris of the 1860s, just like Mumbai in 2013, or Beijing in the run-up to the Olympics of 2004, rebuilding a city meant moving people out of where they had once lived and dumping them far from the city center, far from friends, family, and far from the means to make a living. It also meant that speculators and people with insider knowledge of where Haussmann was going to build his boulevards made fortunes. In Shanghai, there has been a trade-off. The number of square meters of living space per person rose in the decade around the turn of the millennium, just enough to move 1 million people from squalor to the borders of decency. If that trade-off is worth pollution at 500 parts per million, we are not yet sure. Haussmann did create a city in Paris which is remarkably beautiful, but the problem of a city that is a work of art, within the bounds of the peripheric motorway at least, is that works of art get finished. And this Paris is becoming a kind of Venice, with what is outside the peripheric playing the part of the industrial suburb of Mestre, a place which is beautiful, but which no longer has the sense of the metropolitan culture and the economic dynamism that it once had. Works of art are finished. Cities should remain unfinished. Haussmann, however, produced an irresistible model. Le Corbusier was impressed, so was Nicolae Ceausescu and a whole lot of other dictators. So were most of the capitals of Latin America, which, as the 19th century came to an end, all did their best to make something just as impressive. Closer to our own times, we have grown less enthusiastic about the notion of big picture planning. For a while, there was Robert Moses, the J. Edgar Hoover of city planning, the most powerful individual in New York government for 4 decades, a man who could evict slum dwellers, who maintained a kind of personal police force, who built recreation grounds and parkways, and who presented himself as the model of the impartial civil servant, ready to deal with the problems of the city in the interest of the community. A man who presented himself as the embodiment of enlightenment, standing up to long-haired intellectuals and pork-barrel politics. We know how we see his legacy now. The final act of Moses' career was the World's Fair of 1964 in New York, where his vision of the city was played out in unholy marriage with Walt Disney and General Motors. It's also where Andy Warhol was commissioned to do his Most Wanted series, which horrified Moses so much that he ordered them painted out. This too was an example of big picture planning, an attempt at using big events to transform run-down areas of cities. General Motors showed the public how they could plow through freeways, through rainforests, and minority neighborhoods. It's worth remembering that the 1964 World's Fair was the first time that Walt Disney got in on the act and helped out with some of the animatronics. He liked the idea enough to get into city planning on his own account, and there are places in which the idea of attracting Disney or its theme park rivals to set up shop is seen as a weapon in the armory of planning. The West, by and large, fell out of love with big picture planning, even more than we fell out of love with modernism. Big picture planning did not seem to work. It's not just notorious cases like this, the demolition of the Pura-Igo flats in St. Louis, and look closely and you can just about see Saarinen Golden Arch in the background. It's worse even in Britain, where we've demolished slums and replaced them, and then demolished the replacements, in many cases, in the course of no more than a single lifetime. But people still go on making big plans that presuppose the city is a work of art rather than a system or a set of instructions. And while we all know we shouldn't really like it, we all have a soft spot for Brasilia, a place that the last time I was there had people handing out leaflets suggesting that the master plan was handed down by ancient Egyptian astronauts. Clearly, we no longer believe that we earthlings could have done such a wonderful thing on our own account. If anybody was able to slow down the ferocious pace of Robert Moses, it was Jane Jacobs, the Van Helsingen of urbanism, who wrote The Life and Death of Great American Cities. And she has left a long shadow. She provided a powerful embodiment of the point of view for those who see big picture planning as fundamentally misconceived, as crippling, expensive, disaster-prone, and usually ineffective, and subject to the law of unintended consequences. The White Horse Tavern, Jane Jacobs' favorite in Greenwich Village, still exists, but it's a very different New York now from the one that she wrote about. And even then, not everybody agreed with her. Lewis Mumford's review of her most important book in the New Yorker magazine was headlined, "Home Cures for Urban Cancer." It took longer for the message about big picture planning to get through in other areas. Montreal was still ready to mortgage itself to the hilt to build an expo in 1967. The most powerful argument for the transformative power of big picture planning for a city was Barcelona in the run-up to the Olympic Games of 1992. Yes, there was dissent about the gentrification of the Barrier Gothic and the waterfront in Poblenou, but while it was an astonishingly upbeat moment for Catalonia, Barcelona was actually a terrible precedent. It made every city think that they could do the same. Even worse, it made Barcelona think that it could walk on water. The Barcelona precedent suckered Greece into staging the Olympics too. It felt wrong at the time, and now we know just how really wrong it was. Could the country have avoided a Euro bailout if only they had not spent all that money on building all those useless stadiums, just because the Olympic family wanted them to? Here is a victim of the zombies. Note, by the way, the roof on the stadium, the work of the Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava. We will be hearing from him again. François Mitterrand claimed to believe that the Défense Grande Arche was going to be a meeting point between the Paris inside the Périphérique and the other France outside, the meeting between the elite in the old Paris and the dispossessed in the 1960s concrete slums outside. What a wonderful big idea, and what nonsense it turned out to be. Mitterrand was able to use Paris as a kind of sandpit, organizing it with great pure forms. Even Barcelona has found itself running out of ideas, and is no longer quite such a poster boy for the idea of big picture planning. The Olympics of 1992 was a reflection of money well spent. The city has found things harder of late. The Barcelona Forum, for example, shown here, designed by Herzog and de Meuron. It has failed for reasons that have little to do with architecture or with the great financial crisis of the post-credit crunch. It was a project without a real purpose. It failed to animate the city around it because it had no real program. And I fear that Barcelona might be about to do something very similar with this project, the city's new design museum, a project that was designed in a competition more than a decade ago, without a real brief, without a real client, and without really knowing what would take place inside it. Barcelona, it seems, is better at starting things than it is at ensuring that they have a long-term future. Sydney has set an even more difficult precedent. Of course, the Opera House is one of the great marvels of the 20th century. Of course, it was a key part of what made Sydney overtake Melbourne and what made Australia. But it is also what opened the floodgates to a wave of buildings designed by Santiago Calatrava that clutter up Valencia. The zombies arrived and spread the icon building plague, in this case coming out with something that looks a lot like a giant dead lobster. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not against every aspect of big picture planning idea. Big picture planning had that bad name in the 60s and 70s, but there were some issues and decisions ways that had to be faced. We cannot always postpone and avoid. Here is a dramatic image of the ritualized war that went on for 5 years between the Japanese left and the Japanese police. It was more important for them to fight for the rights of Japanese rice farmers than to give Tokyo a modern airport. In retrospect, they were fighting the wrong war, and those radicals ended up running Japan's big corporations. How do we deal with that now? We are in a situation where we question big picture planning, just as we did in the 1960s. Now we tend to believe that they are too expensive, they take too long, and they don't work. But look at how bad Britain now is at dealing with those issues that demand that wider view. No political party wants to live up to the consequences of taking a decision about what to do with London's chronic airport problems. No party in Britain is comfortable facing up to the issues of a high-speed rail line. Britain is the only big Western European economy without a high-speed rail network. Now it's finding itself impossible to face up to the challenge from the golf course owners whose backyards the line will pass through. We find it in Britain impossible to make those decisions. We put them off for political reasons, and that has a way of making things worse. There is another corrosive effect. Architects and planners travel around the world, and they see that there are other ways of doing things than in Western Europe and North America. Spending too much time in some parts of Asia leads a certain kind of professional to start speculating about how much better things could be without the pesky need for democratic process. Let's hope that that's not the next big idea about the city to go viral. We question big ideas in planning, but we need them now more than ever. We need to find ways to make those ideas make sense in the wider world. In the West, we have lived in the kind of cities that were made by the first industrial revolution and lasted for 200 years, cities made by steam engines and railways. We're in the midst of a transformation of city life that will make every previous one shrink into insignificance. We saw what such an apparently minor, non-tech innovation as the shipping container could have on the city. It killed ports and downtowns around the world. We are now finding out what massively more complex and pervasive innovations will do. Nobody asked us about the impact that Amazon and the server farms will have on the city, but they're there. We're now facing up to a world that looks like this, a world in which the workplace of Apple looks like that. We are faced with a world in which we don't really have the equipment to deal with these changes. Change has real consequences. We may be skeptical about the big picture, but unless we're able to harness the potential of big ideas about cities, unless we are prepared to have a vision and accept the obligations of leadership, we cannot rely on being able to solve every problem one pothole at a time. Unless we are ready to look the issues in the eye, then we have no protection from the zombies and their viral ideas. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Deyan. That was a very nuanced talk that really points out the sort of the circularity of the issue, right? The sort of big picture and leads to zombie. It's sort of zombie planning sometimes, which is something we don't want, and yet we still need the big picture somehow in the end. Do we build Olympic stadiums, or do we plan high-speed rails? I mean, in the case of Britain, the example you brought up with sort of the airport, the sort of indecisiveness and paralysis with airports and other infrastructure projects compared to your sort of critique of Olympic projects, made me sort of wonder, for you, having been on the jury that selected Zaha's Aquatic Center for the London Olympics, if you had any sort of insight into what it is that makes one kind of big picture planning possible, perhaps the zombie version versus the other kind of big picture planning which is not happening, for example, with the airport.
Maybe it's also fast food planning. It's the idea that there's an instant solution to deal with quick problems in a defined time scale. And cities don't really take kindly to that kind of approach. Hardly anything does. I think it's really, we lack a kind of critical debate about what it is that we really want to do about cities. We don't really have that equipment. There's not enough focuses and forums for that. So what we are reduced to is a few ideas, which, as I was saying, spread around the world. They're taken as instant solutions and they're trashed again within 5 years.
Sure. Are there any questions from the audience? I can't tell whether you have a question or if you're just stretching. Yes, in the corner, please.
We had a fantastic exhibition at the Design Museum, which opened 2 weeks ago. And at this point in the press conference, when it was about Paul Smith, the fashion designer, and in the press conference to open it, he took the precaution of bringing a large shopping bag full of socks. And the first questioner could get a choice of sock. No socks today. Question in the back.
Yeah, sorry, my voice is really bad, but thank you very much for a little bit of a criticism and counterintuitive thinking. Everyone seems to be in awe with all beautiful designers and architects and all these big plans that we have. And now we come to know that we have big white elephants and things that we stay with behind. This afternoon, Dr. Lars Nidve will be speaking about the M+ project and the West Kowloon development that we have here in Hong Kong. What is your take on that project, and how can we make sure that urban planning and all these new areas connect with the city and are not creating zombies all over again?
I don't think anyone could accuse the West Kowloon project of being instant planning. It's been through several iterations. It disposed of the idea of building a Guggenheim, and I guess this is a city which works fast, but also has the determination to learn from the best and to make its own decisions about the future. But you know more about that than I do, Eric.
Well, no, you sort of avoid the question there, Deyan, because I think initially in your talk you sort of you had West Kowloon under the category of zombie.
No, not at all. I was actually trying to point out that these ideas are they're not all zombies, but.
No, let's go back to this idea of sort of the inevitability in some ways of always going back to these sort of big picture ideas. I mean, you started and almost ended your presentation with Brasilia, which of course has been described, I think, in the best way as both the glory and the grave of modernism. Now, I think we all, as you said, we all understand why we ought not to like it, but and yet somehow we all seem to still love it. And I'm wondering what that says to you about the other kinds of the other sort of power of zombie planning, the sort of undeniably seductive appeal of these kinds of projects.
Brasilia worked, I guess, because it had Niemeyer and Costa, who were homegrown Brazilians who had a very strong sense of what that city meant to them. The zombie approach would have been to hire Calatrava.
And how about China? I mean, you were just in Beijing yesterday. I think there's a kind of planning, whether zombie or big picture, going on such a massive scale. I mean, you talk about Jane Jacobs in your lecture, and one wonders if that kind of approach, that sort of Jane Jacobs approach, is even possible in a society where you're dealing at such vast scales, at such...
Probably Beijing is big enough for both of these things to coexist in a kind of urban soup. I made the point about Shanghai and that transformation providing enough increase in living space for millions of people to move from squalor to civilization or more civil living conditions, but that's at a cost. And
okay. Do we have time for more questions? No. Okay. Well, Dan, thanks so much. That was fantastic. Thank you.